What is going on, everybody? What is going on, the Catch fam? My name is John Dawson, and in today's video, we will be continuing my series of early 2022 fantasy football rankings. We're going through the wide receiver position today, numbers 13 through 24. If you do enjoy today's content, make sure to hit that like button down below. Of course, hit that subscribe button if you are new to the channel, and feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below, and let me know what you think of today's list as well. Without further ado, let's hop into the video. All right, number 13 overall, I've got Diontae Johnson, which might surprise some of you guys with the question mark at the quarterback position overall, and I get it. Okay, listen, you got Kenny Pickett hanging around the Steelers' first round draft selection, and you've got Mitchell Trubisky as well. At this point in the offseason, we still do not know who the QB1 is going to be. But overall for me, I don't think that it's going to matter. When you really look at the past 3 years for Ben Roethlisberger, who was that primary quarterback for Diontae Johnson, but don't forget that he was injured at times. We did see some play out of Mason Rudolph and some other backups, but at the end of the day, it was mainly Roethlisberger who built that chemistry with Johnson, and he really wasn't playing at an all-time high level by any means. And I really don't think that an aging Ben Roethlisberger, although he's a Hall of Fame quarterback and I have all the respect in the world for him, and still a much better quarterback overall, is that drastically different from a fantasy perspective than Mitchell Trubisky or possibly a young Kenny Pickett as well. Only time will tell, but overall, I still think that Diontae Johnson is a primary #1 target without a doubt for the Pittsburgh Steelers. I get that some of you out there would rather draft Chase Claypool and pay a lower price, but for me, I love Johnson. I love the value where you can grab him in drafts right now, and I think he is that good that he should be easily in the top 15 in fantasy rankings overall. Finished as wide receiver 8 in PPR last season, wide receiver 12 in standard scoring formats, had 169 targets overall, 107 receptions, just over 1,100 receiving yards, and 8 touchdowns. I'm all for Diontae Johnson. If his ADP continues to sit where it is at, moving towards a regular season, I am completely fine with that. I will draft him all day long, and he comes in at number 13 on my early wide receiver rankings. All right, number 14 on today's list, we've got Michael Pittman of the Indianapolis Colts. Gives a little bit of a change at the quarterback position, going from Carson Wentz to Matt Ryan. But for me, that doesn't personally make a huge difference. I don't think that Matt Ryan's play is going to be too incredibly elevated over Carson Wentz, at least from a fantasy perspective, at least in terms of the wide receiver position. And similar to Diontae Johnson, without a doubt, Michael Pittman is the wide receiver 1 for the Indianapolis Colts, and that's what we're looking for as we start to move into this next tier of receivers overall. Are they the clear-cut #1 target? Obviously, the Colts are going to be a run-first team, but that obviously doesn't mean that JT is the #1 target. Michael Pittman's the #1 target, and I think that Matt Ryan is going to absolutely feed him this season. I think he's going to move up a couple spots at the end of the day in fantasy from where he finished last season, which was number 17 overall in PPR scoring formats, number 16 in standard scoring formats through 17 games, had 129 targets, just 88 receptions. Maybe part of that was Carson Wentz's fault, so maybe Matt Ryan does bring a big upgrade here, but overall, just over 1,000 receiving yards and 6 touchdowns. I like him to get closer to 10 total touchdowns and closer to 1,300 receiving yards overall. I think he's going to have a very good season. I got no problem putting him in my top 15 heading into the 2022 fantasy football season. All right, number 15 on the list, we got my guy T. Higgins. You guys know I have been a huge advocate all offseason long for going out and targeting T. Higgins for your 2022 fantasy football rosters, and his name has really moved up in ADP since the end of the regular season. Came in last season as wide receiver 24 in PPR and wide receiver 17 in standard. Overall, had 110 targets, 74 receptions, just over 1,000 receiving yards, and 6 touchdowns. Very similar numbers to Michael Pittman, who we just talked about, but T. Higgins is a different type of player. He is that upside boomer bust type of player. He's the first receiver on today's list that is the wide receiver 2, has a true wide receiver 1 in front of him overall. But I love me some T. Higgins. I love the direction that the Bengals offense is moving towards. We touched on this when we talked about Jamar Chase in our last video. that offensive line has been completely bolstered. I really think it's going to make a difference for Joe Burrow and company. I love this receiving core overall. I think Tyler Boyd is going to be a steal at his current ADP, but that's a story for a different video. Listen, man, T. Higgins provides that nice upside type player. You're going to have to draft him probably the end of the second round into the third round. And throughout the season, don't get me wrong, you're going to be more comfortable playing him at the flex as he does provide some instability, but he does provide a ton of upside. Like we stated, he's a little bit of a boomer bust receiver, but I still like him enough to put him in the top 15, and I still think that upside is worth where his current ADP is going. I think he's going to have a very solid 2022 fantasy football season overall. All right, number 16, we've got my guy Scary Terry, who a lot of you guys are scared to draft or to add to your fantasy rosters at this point in the offseason. I get it, okay? Carson Wentz is the QB. But we just talked about Michael Pittman, and listen, Pittman had a decent season last year, like we just touched on, had a very good season overall. Scary Terry himself last season with a couple different rotating QBs, and don't get me wrong, guys, okay? You know, like Carson Wentz is fine. I don't think he's that much of an upgrade over Taylor Heineke. I actually think Heineke played decently last season overall, so I don't think this is too much of a change realistically for Terry McLaurin, but what you can look at the end of the day is what Michael Pittman and Carson Wentz were able to do last season. And look at Terry McLaurin's statistics from last season: 130 targets, 77 receptions, just over 1,000 receiving yards, and 5 touchdowns. That brought him in as wide receiver 25 in PPR scoring formats, wide receiver 24 in standard scoring formats. Do you think he's a lock for between 75 and 90 receptions, over 1,000 receiving yards, and 5 to 7 touchdowns as a whole? I do think that Carson Wentz doesn't negatively impact him overall from a fantasy perspective, but at the end of the day, I don't think he's going to make as much of a jump or really too much of a progression overall, where I think in Michael Pittman's case, going from Carson Wentz to Matt Ryan, he'll be able to make a little bit of a leap statistically speaking overall. But at the end of the day, like we talked about a little bit earlier in today's video, Terry McLaurin will be the #1 target for the Washington Commanders, almost at the Washington football team, but for Washington overall, and that is what I'm looking for in this tier of receivers overall. So I still believe in Scary Terry. I mean, this is a guy who a lot of fantasy managers were going out and drafting in the second round last season, going into 2021. So I do think that we should not forget about the value that he presents. He's a very talented receiver. As long as he re-signs with Washington, we don't have any issues there. I think he's going to have a solid year overall, and I'm going to put him at number 16 moving into the 2022 fantasy football season. All right, number 17 on today's list, we've got Jaylen Waddle of the Miami Dolphins. Waddle moves back just slightly in my current rankings due to the addition of Tyreek Hill to that offense. Listen, I still love Waddle, but if Tyreek Hill was not traded to the Dolphins, I would probably have Waddle right around that 13 or 14 mark. He would be much higher overall, definitely in front of guys like Pittman and Scary Terry. But at the end of the day, we've got Tyreek Hill on that team, and I still think that's not necessarily a negative for Jaylen Waddle, although it will eat into some of those targets overall, but it will open up things throughout the season as well for Jaylen Waddle. I think he's going to still be Tua's #1 target at the end of the day. These two are best friends. Don't forget about that. Came in as wide receiver 13 in PPR last season and wide receiver 21 in standard scoring formats. Overall, 140 targets, 104 receptions, just over 1,000 receiving yards, and 6 touchdowns. I do think that he'll be able to improve on those numbers overall. I won't be surprised if Waddle outperforms some of the receivers that we've gone over already today. I do like Waddle a lot, don't get me wrong, and he's got a great draft value at the moment. So I'm all for Waddle. I think that Miami is going to have a pretty decent season from a fantasy perspective overall, but he just moves back slightly at the moment just due to maybe some of those targets getting ate up by Tyreek Hill. But like I said, I won't be surprised if he finishes in front of some of the receivers we talked about today. But at the moment, I'm going to leave him at number 17 heading into the 2022 fantasy football season. All right, number 18 on today's list, we've got my guy, Brandin Cooks. Listen, guys, I am all for Brandin Cooks. I got no problem whatsoever putting him in my top 20 at 18 overall. Had a great season last year, coming in as wide receiver 20 in both standard and PPR scoring formats. 134 targets, 90 receptions, just over 1,000 receiving yards, and 6 touchdowns. Very similar numbers to a lot of the players that we've talked about today. And I think that Brandin Cooks just gets slept on year after year after year, so I am trying to avoid you guys sleeping on him heading into 2022. Listen, Texans did go out and draft John Mechie III, and I like Mechie as a late round selection as well. I do think he'll be a factor within this offense, but outside of that, you don't have any receivers that I believe are going to make a huge impact. And listen, man, Davis Mills had a pretty decent rookie season overall. I think he's going to take some steps forward in his sophomore season. I think that Cooks will be a big part of that. I think at the end of the day, as long as Cooks can stay fully healthy as he is, at the end of the day, a veteran receiver, I do think he can finish once again with around 90 receptions, over 1,000 receiving yards, 6 to 8 touchdowns. And that is what we are looking for in this tier. So I got no problem with Cooks. I think he's a clear-cut #1 receiver in that room. If anything, I think that the addition of John Mechie III will help open up some things for Brandin Cooks in terms of less defensive pressure. And I'm not ready to give up on Brandin Cooks as a later round value receiver who will get you over 1,000 receiving yards and a few scores moving into 2022. All right, number 19 on the list, I had to bring up a Broncos receiver at some point within this top 24, or else I feel like I would be crucified. Okay, so listen, guys, this might be a little bit controversial. I don't have Jerry Jeudy in my top 24. He's right outside of my top 24 rankings at this point in the offseason. Listen, you could easily argue for Jeudy being in this spot over Courtland Sutton. I totally get it. I know a lot of you guys feel more bullish on Jerry Jeudy, but for whatever reason, I just have a better overall feeling about Courtland Sutton. I won't be surprised if at the end of the day, Jeudy has a better fantasy season, and I won't be surprised if Courtland Sutton has a better fantasy season. And at this point in the offseason, like I said, that is where I'm at. I'm leaning towards Sutton overall. Don't forget about my boy Tim Patrick in later rounds either, but at the end of the day, one of those two receivers, Sutton or Jeudy, has to be in the top 24 with the addition of Russell Wilson to that offense. He is going to completely change that offense as a whole, and he's going to be feeding his new targets. Listen, there's not a lot I can say here. He didn't have a great season last year. Did play in 17 games. I get that the QB position was close to abysmal last season. Came in as wide receiver 44 in PPR, 47 in standard, off of 98 targets, just 58 receptions. Not good numbers there. Don't get me wrong. 776 receiving yards and 2 touchdowns. I am of the belief that Russell Wilson is really going to bring Courtland Sutton back to what we saw in 2019, where he had that phenomenal season before getting injured in 2020. So I still believe in the value that Sutton holds. I still believe in him overall. Don't get me wrong, I'm not totally against Jerry Jeudy. Maybe I just feel bad because Jeudy burnt me last season. But at the end of the day, the Broncos receivers didn't have a lot to work with. I think this is going to be a very, very different looking offense moving into 2022. Let me know in the comments down below what Broncos receiver you feel the most bullish on. For me, at the moment, I'm going with Courtland Sutton as my number 19 receiver moving into the 2022 fantasy football season. All right, number 20 on the list, we got Mike Williams, who you could easily argue should be higher on this list. Moves back a little bit for me just due to that extreme boomer bust capability that he does present. Don't get me wrong, he had a phenomenal start to the season last year and definitely turned it back on towards the end of the season as well. I think that Justin Herbert's going to continue to improve in his junior year. I think that the Chargers offense will be right up there with one of the best in the entire league, and I think that Mike Williams is going to have another phenomenal season. Came in as wide receiver 12 in PPR last season, wide receiver 9 in standard scoring formats, 129 targets overall, 76 receptions, but don't forget, like I said, he's going for those big boomer bust type plays down the field anyways, so that number I'm not too concerned about. 1,146 receiving yards and 9 touchdowns overall. Listen, Mike Williams has got all the talent in the world. Yes, he presents some boomer bust potential, maybe the most boomer bust potential out of any receiver. He has had some injury issues as well, but overall I think that a lot of fantasy managers really still want to go out and target Mike Williams just because they believe in the development of Justin Herbert and the development of the Chargers offense as a whole. I still like Keenan Allen more from a consistency standpoint, and I think that Mike Williams is a perfect boomer bust type receiver. I put him right next to T. Higgins in terms of a wide receiver 2 on a team that provides boomer bust potential. I still love Mike Williams. You could easily argue that he should be higher on this list, but personally I go for a little bit more consistency at the receiver position, like a lot of the players we talked about today, over that boomer bust value. If you do go for the players who might get you 40 points one week and then 2 points the next week, then 8 points, then 25 points, that's fine. I totally get it. But if you do go out and target Mike Williams, more than likely you're going to want to play him at the flex and hit on another receiver in later rounds who you can play as your wide receiver 2. But still, don't get me wrong, he's going to have a great year if he's fully healthy. I just am not in love with the way that he's going to get there. At the end of the day, I got all the love in the world for Mike Williams. I think he's going to have a fantastic fantasy football season in 2022. We'll put him at my number 20 receiver overall. All right, guys, I can take the heat in the comments down below for having Hunter Renfrow in my top 24 without a doubt. You guys know all offseason long I have been tooting the horn for Hunter Renfrow, even with the addition of DEVONTA Adams to that offense. I feel very good about the Raiders offense moving into 2022 overall. And for Renfrow, I don't think the addition of Adams is going to hurt him too incredibly much from a fantasy perspective. Don't get me wrong, DEVONTA Adams is absolutely one of the best receivers in the entire National Football League. He is going to take targets away from Renfrow, but at the same time, a lot of the other receivers that we've talked about who have had additions at the receiver position to their offense, I think that this will benefit Hunter Renfrow. I think this will help open up some things for Renfrow overall. He came in as wide receiver number 11 in PPR scoring formats last season, as well as number 14 in standard scoring formats last season. He had a phenomenal season. I get it. He was the number 1 target for Derek Carr. He will now be the number 2 target, but that is not necessarily a bad thing. I'm telling you guys, I think he is going to have a phenomenal season. 128 targets last season, 103 receptions, just over 1,000 receiving yards, and 9 touchdowns. In my eyes, I think he can repeat what he did last season and potentially add on a dozen or so more receptions, as well as a couple dozen more receiving yards, and hopefully another touchdown or 2. I do think he's still going to be effective within the red zone. Don't get me wrong, guys. Darren Waller missed a lot of last season as well. He should come back fully healthy. That will affect things as well, but I really think that Renfrow is going to act like that security blanket for Derek Carr. He's going to be that slot guy. He's going to get a ton of receptions this season, especially if you play in full PPR. I think that Renfrow is a beautiful wide receiver to go out and target, especially at his current ADP. So I'll put Renfrow as my number 21 receiver heading into the 2022 fantasy football season. All right, number 22 on today's list, we've got Hollywood Brown with a change of scenery coming from the Baltimore Ravens going to the Arizona Cardinals. And listen, man, I love Hollywood Brown. I think he is one of the better wide receiver 2 options going into the 2022 season, but for the first 6 games of the year, he's going to be the wide receiver 1 for the Cardinals. So you could even argue he should be a little bit higher on today's list. I think he'll start to lose some value potentially as the season goes on and Hopkins comes back into that offense. But at the same time, the same argument I just made for Hunter Renfrow, I think when Hopkins comes back, that could help alleviate some defensive pressure, of course, for Hollywood Brown. It's going to be very interesting to see how teams line up against Hopkins, Hollywood Brown, Zach Ertz, James Conner out of the backfield, Kyler Murray at QB. I'm excited for the Cardinals offense as a whole, and I do think that if you are bullish on that offense from a fantasy perspective, that you could definitely argue Hollywood Brown should be higher overall. But he came in as wide receiver 22 in PPR last season, exactly where we've got him ranked today, wide receiver 26 in standard scoring formats. Had a really great start to the season, finally saw that kind of breakout season for Hollywood Brown as a whole. He had a pretty good year in 2020, especially in the red zone, but in 2021, 145 targets overall, 91 receptions, just over 1,000 receiving yards, and 6 touchdowns. The exact type of stats we are looking for in today's tier of wide receivers overall. I think he's having a great season, even when Hopkins is back, but you do get that added benefit. The first 6 weeks of the season, Hopkins will be sitting through his suspension. I think that Hollywood Brown is going to have a ton of targets in that Cardinals offense, and he's going to have a great year. So he comes in at number 22 for my early wide receiver rankings heading into the 2022 fantasy football season. Number 23, we got my boy Darnell Mooney, another receiver I've been tooting the horn for all off season long. There's a couple of reasons why Mooney's a little bit further back on today's list, and I think you could probably argue he should be even further back in some people's rankings. I totally get it. I believe in Mooney as a whole, and I believe in the chemistry between him and Justin Fields. Came in as wide receiver 23 in PPR, wide receiver 22 in standard, so pretty close, pretty much exactly where we've got him ranked today. Okay, 140 targets, 81 receptions, just over 1,000 receiving yards, 4 touchdowns. We'd like to see him improve on that touchdown number in 2022, but I think that he can easily repeat the targets, receptions, and receiving yards. He is definitely, without a doubt, Justin Fields' #1 target. And like I said, I believe in that chemistry between Fields and Mooney, but the biggest issue for me here is I don't believe in the Bears offense whatsoever. Don't get me wrong, I'm a fan of David Montgomery at the running back position. I'm a fan of Mooney at the receiver position. I do think that Kmet is a talented tight end. I do think that Justin Fields could be a very talented QB in the league, but that offensive line is just abysmal. And in my opinion, there's not much offensive support outside of those couple of players I just named. I do think that Herbert is a decent running back handcuff, but getting back to the main point here, I just have a bad feeling about the Bears offense as a whole. At the end of the day though, bad offenses can still produce good fantasy players. And at Mooney's current ADP, I think he is definitely a receiver to consider targeting in 2022 fantasy football drafts. I know at this point in the offseason, he has been a steal in my opinion in a lot of the mock drafts that we've ran here at the Catch. At the end of the day, for me, I think he's a lock for over 1,000 receiving yards, a couple scores, around 80 receptions, and I think he's going to have another solid season heading into 2022. All right, last receiver on today's list, we've got my guy DEVONTA Smith. I know he's a lot lower on other rankings out there overall, but you guys know all offseason I have been tooting the horn like crazy for DEVONTA Smith. I want him on my 2022 fantasy football rosters. He is just a player that I think has a very good fantasy outlook and a beautiful ADP. And for me personally, I would be lying if I did not have him in my top 24. There are plenty other receivers who did not make the top 24 that you could argue could be here on top of other guys, but I'm giving you guys my own personal conviction and players that I want personally. So I have no problem whatsoever putting DEVONTA Smith at the 24 mark. A great rookie season overall, came in as wide receiver 29 PPR, wide receiver 30 in standard, 104 targets, 64 receptions, 916 receiving yards, and 5 touchdowns. Not a bad rookie season whatsoever. I personally think he will improve on all of those numbers and finish within the top 25 to top 20 at the receiver position in 2022. I think he's going to have a very consistent year at the position, and I think he's going to take a huge step forward in his sophomore season, continue that chemistry with Jalen Hurts. And guess what? I love the addition of AJ Brown to this offense for DEVONTA Smith. I think it's going to open up a ton for him, help take the top off the defense when Brown is healthy and playing. I love the addition. I got no problem with it whatsoever. Don't get me wrong, Goddard is a factor at the tight end position here as well, but I think DEVONTA Smith is a clear-cut number 2 receiver on this team, but still that security type blanket, similar to some of the other players we talked about today, like Hunter Renfrow. I think that Jalen Hurts will depend on him when he needs an open target or when he is in trouble. I love DEVONTA Smith. I love the chemistry that we saw last year between Hurts and Smith. And simply put, I think he will improve on all of his rookie numbers and take a step forward in his sophomore season. He has been one of my favorite receivers all offseason long, and I am not giving up on that belief. So I'll happily put him as my 24th receiver in my early 2022 fantasy football rankings at the wide receiver position. And that'll do it for today's video. If you did enjoy today's content, be sure to hit that like button down below, hit that subscribe button, come join the Catch Fan Baby on the road to 1,000 subscribers. We would love to help you dominate your fantasy football seasons in 2022. Make sure to join our Discord, link is in the description down below. Feel free to hop into any of our free live subscriber mock drafts throughout the week. And most importantly, drop a comment down below with what you thought of today's rankings as a whole. Let me know what receivers I am too bullish on. Let me know what wide receivers should have made the top 24 that did not. Let me know what wide receivers you absolutely hated in today's video. If you have any questions, concerns, or comments pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season, feel free to drop those down below as well. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on the Catch